In the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict, which has entered its third week and led to severe humanitarian crisis in Gaza, there is a growing scrutiny of the United Nations and its ability to facilitate international diplomacy for a ceasefire. To shed light on this matter, I asked former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kantathi Suphamongkhon. We saw the attempt in UN Security Council to pass the resolution, but it failed 4 times because of the block of the vote by US and Russia. What's the meaning behind this? What do you read the situation?
The Security Council has the task under the UN Charter of acting to protect, that's Chapter 7, protect international peace and security. But the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council has the veto power. So what we saw, we had 4 actually attempts at introducing draft resolutions at the Security Council. 2 attempts by Russia. That failed because it did not get the majority. Now, the majority that they need to have is 9. They did not get that, so there was no need for a veto. So the Russian attempts, 2 attempts failed without the use of a veto power. Okay? And the US had support for its own resolution, but the Russians and the Chinese vetoed. So that also failed. Now, that was because of the exercise of the veto power by China and Russia. Brazil introduced a draft, which actually was a compromise, because Brazil, as I heard from the inside, had negotiated very, very carefully with all parties concerned, especially with the US. And so it included the wording important to the US. For example, condemning what happened in Israel on October 7th, the Hamas attack. But in the end, unfortunately, the US voted against that draft resolution, even though 12 other countries have voted in favor. So that was a veto, because it passed the 9 countries mark. So once that was done, the US explained the reason behind the veto, and that was because even though the draft had been negotiated to a great degree, the US said that because the draft failed to mention Israel's right of self-defense. So that was why the US vetoed that draft resolution. So that was the failure of 4 attempts. My observation on that is that the UN Charter explicitly says in Article 51 that all members of the United Nations have the inherent right of self-defense. Anyway, so that's already there. And it was unfortunate that because it wasn't there in this particular resolution, but it was there at the charter level, the US was not able to accept this and had to cast a veto. So when that failed, then because of the availability under the resolution called Uniting for Peace Resolution, which came about in 1950 because of the Korean War situation. During the Korean War situation, the Soviet Union then vetoed certain resolutions. It was a deadlock at the Security Council. So the General Assembly had the Uniting for Peace resolution, which allowed the General Assembly to take up the issues concerning international peace and security. The distinction between the resolutions of the Security Council and the resolutions of the General Assembly is that the resolution of the Security Council would be legally binding. But resolutions of the General Assembly are recommendations only. But what we have seen 121 countries. It was 120 recorded, but another country came forward later saying that they had actually voted in favor, but there was a technical problem. So 121 countries out of 193 countries supported this resolution in the General Assembly. That is the moral authority of this resolution. It does not have the legal authority, but it tells the world that 121 countries out of 193 countries, more than 2/3 of the international community, the membership of the UN, support this resolution, which calls for a humanitarian truce. It did not even call for a ceasefire, which was actually the first intention of Jordan and the co-sponsors. But it ended up with the word humanitarian truce. And so it shows the overwhelming opinion of the world community.
But what's the implication of the UN General Assembly resolution? Because the two major countries regarding the situation, Israel and the US, vote no for the resolution, even though 120, the majority vote yes to the resolution. What's the outcome of this? Because you just mentioned that it's non-binding agreement. Yes. So what will be the impact?
Unfortunately, it's non-binding, but it has the reflection of the will of and the opinion of the international community, 121 countries now. So it has the moral authority. So if you look, the moral authority has a weight in itself, but unfortunately, the reality is that Israel will probably continue, but maybe it will realize the significance of the moral authority, and there are penalties to go against the moral authority in many different ways. You know, the reputation of the country and other things. So these are the things that I hope will convince Israel to be mindful that the international community wants a truce to protect civilians under international law and under international humanitarian law must be protected. You cannot have an unlimited war. So this is the message from the world community.
Does it mean the deadlock of international diplomacy regarding the mechanism of the UN? And in your view, do you think the war will escalate into the region?
It is important to be very afraid of escalation because it's possible to escalate. Escalate means expanding into a fight between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. When you expand the war into a regional war, this is now a localized situation, it's always very dangerous. So I hope all the parties concerned will be very mindful of that. There is a risk of escalation, yes.
How do you read the close alliance between the US and Israel in having major role in this conflict?
Well, I think the US has a policy situation at this point. There are many layers of policy. The one explanation that has been given for many, many years is that US so-called unconditional support for Israel. And I feel that it's not unconditional, but there is a perception that there is an unconditional US support for Israel has been due to the Jewish lobby in the US. That has been one explanation. But when you look at the situation now, you will see that there's also a conflict between the US and China, as well as the US and Russia. So in the Security Council, we noticed that Russia and China vetoed a draft that was put forward by the U.S. So you do have that situation. And Iran, the U.S. Is trying to mend relations with Iran to a certain degree, but there are still problems. So you have all these other equations which makes the U.S. maybe even more supportive of Israel to a degree. So you have all these variables in place. But I understand that the U.S. Is now warning Israel about the importance of protecting civilians. Israel wants to eliminate Hamas. The U.S. supports the elimination of Hamas since the U.S. considers Hamas a terrorist organization. But the civilians must be protected. And I think the warning that the U.S. had given to Israel has made some impact. There has been a delay in the use of ground forces. So we hope that prudence will prevail and caution will prevail.
Response from Israel on the 7th of October from Prime Minister Netanyahu. He said this is 9/11 version on Israel. What do you see the impact or the aftermath out of this with the viewpoint of Israel to see this as 9/11? What can they learn from the real 9/11 from the U.S.?
Oh, well, it was unacceptable to have a group of people, from Gaza kill innocent civilians, as we saw on October 7th. It is, in a way, traumatic for Israel as 9/11 was traumatic for the U.S. But you will notice, though, that U.S. reaction to that attack on the World Trade Center by going to war in Afghanistan and also eventually going to war in Iraq did not bear much success. After 20 years of fighting in Afghanistan, the Taliban are back and the U.S. withdrew. Iraq is still a problem, as you know. So be careful, because if Israel goes in to Gaza, to the Strip, there are tunnels that Hamas have been digging and forming. The tunnels, I believe, are 30 miles, 300 miles long, 300 miles. And it's under...
More than 500 kilometers.
Yes. And Gaza is such a small area, and so fighting inside a city, inside an urban situation, house to house, building to building, is going to be very, very difficult, even though Israel may have confidence to a degree. But it's difficult. What I would have liked to see is the continuation of law enforcement action by Israel. For example, Israel, since it left Gaza in 2005, Shin Bet, the Israeli security apparatus, has been very successful to a degree in identifying and eliminating and arresting terrorists. I think that route should be used again to at the maximum degree to do law enforcement rather than collective punishment. I think collective punishment has to be prohibited. It is a violation of international law. So go for the bad guys and deal with them accordingly, but civilians must be protected.
It's very controversial, the saying by the statement by UN Secretary General Antonio Gutteres. He said Israel should look back to the past 75 years as well, because what happening with Palestine or Hamas doesn't just happen in Hamas attack doesn't happen in vacuum.
Yes.
That's what he said. And of course, Israel doesn't like this.
Well, the Secretary General has mentioned, and he used the word, October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. It has background leading to that. And the background is the way that the Palestinians had been treated, more or less, by Israel. And that is a controversial situation. You know, Gaza has been isolated. In the West Bank, you have the continuation of the Israeli settlers deep inside the West Bank of the Jordan River, which is occupied territory. So you have a situation in which Palestine is occupied by Israel. So Israel has that responsibility to ensure that the people of Palestine will receive their freedom, and I think eventually it has to go back to the two-state solution. So you will have Israel and the state of Palestine with recognized borders, living peacefully with one another. The issue of Jerusalem has to be settled. You know, East Jerusalem could become the capital of Palestine, whereas West Jerusalem remains now, as Israel has declared capital of Israel. So a solution based on the two-state solution and the settlement of the Jerusalem problem remains the ultimate goal.
Geographically, it's quite far from Thailand. It happens in the Middle East, but Thai people are being affected. What do you think Thailand, especially in terms of foreign policy, should be careful in this international politics of Israel and Hamas?
Well, Thailand has emphasized the fact that we are not a party to the conflict, and that is correct. So we are interested, the government is interested in protecting the lives of Thai people. Since the situation now is still fragile and uncertain, my hope is that all Thais will return to Thailand. And what the Speaker of the Parliament has done has been very effective so far in traveling, in sending a delegation to Iran to talk to representatives of Hamas. I think, I hope that the end result will be the release of all Thais. The other channel that we can look to would be Doha and Qatar. Doha hosts the leaders of Hamas are actually in Doha. So all those diplomatic means we should utilize.
Dr. Kantathi, thank you very much for joining me. ขอบคุณค่ะ
My pleasure. Thank
ค่ะ
you.